So I think in general, non-black photographers really struggle to shoot darker skin. And I'm not going to be politically correct in this video. I'm going to say white people. I'm going to say black people. Okay, we don't need to try to be all politically correct. We just need to talk about properly exposing for black skin. I see way too many pictures of black people where they are washed out, their skin looks ashy. And we need to fix that, because one thing about black people with melanin in their skin, a lot of black people are very proud of their color. And so when they work with a photographer that doesn't photograph them and produce images that are realistic to their actual skin tone, their color, it is offensive. You guys really have to understand that it is offensive. And that is why a lot of black individuals will only work with black photographers for that reason. But there also are black photographers I've seen that seem to struggle with photographing black people as well. So in this video, I kind of want to just break down the nuances of it and why it's such a struggle for a lot of photographers. And hopefully this will help you if you are in the situation of struggling to photograph darker skin tones. This will help you. Now, the first thing that we really have to talk about, and the first thing that you really have to understand, is the camera meter. Now, there is a lot that goes into the meter. You've probably heard of 18% gray, which is a middle shade of gray, and people wonder, why isn't it 50%? You really just need to go on Google, because there's a whole scientific thing behind the 18%. It has to do with the reflectivity of light. So there's a whole thing on that. But at the end of the day, camera meters are designed to meter for the scene to be an 18% gray, which is middle gray. Now, there are some arguments that newer cameras are going more 12%, but 12% to 18% is only half a stop. You wouldn't really even be able to tell the difference probably. So that is moot. But the thing about it is, the meters essentially are not as accurate as I think photographers make them out to be. And when I say they're not accurate, it isn't so much the light that it is seeing and coming up with its determination of what's 18% gray, but more so the whole concept behind it is just trying to find a average starting point, right? So when you think about something being 18% or middle gray, if you have a scene that is overly bright, obviously your camera meter is going to see that brightness and it is going to want to bring that down to a middle gray. So you're going to have something that's really bright. Think about snow. It is not going to want snow to be as white as it should be, because it wants it to be middle gray. The same thing if you have a really dark scene. Take something black, for example. The camera is going to think that the light that's being reflected off of that black surface is underexposed. So it's going to want you to bring the exposure up. So if you are a photographer that are always aiming to have your meter and your camera at that 0 point, there's likely going to be a lot of times that you are underexposing or overexposing based off of the scene. But this absolutely plays a factor with darker skin tones. Now, if you think about what I just said, obviously darker skin tones would favor more on the black side, whereas your lighter skin tones and your pale skin tones are going to favor more towards the white side. So if you are photographing a black person or someone with darker skin tones and you are relying solely on your meter, most of the time you are going to overexpose dark skin. It really is that simple. So you have to understand that the meter is really just a tool. It is not something that you should be striving for. It really is a starting point, and then you should look at what you have in front of you, the subject, and make a determination from there whether you need to overexpose based off of the meter or underexpose. Now, you also have to take into account your background, because most photographers in general, they use evaluative or matrix metering, and essentially what that does is it takes the entire scene, it kind of comes up with an average based off of all of the tones within that scene, and your meter is looking at luminosity, it's looking at reflected light, so it's looking at everything in the scene and it's trying to get an overall average of that entire scene, 18%. Now, you also can have center weighted, or you can have spot meter. Now, spot meter can be good, but I know maybe with the newer cameras this is different. I know in the DSLR world, when you did spot metering, it technically only spot metered at the center. I know some of the higher end cameras would do it based off of your focus point. So you'd have to check your camera to see if you put it on spot metering, if it actually meters based off of your focus point or if it is just in the center. But spot metering will help you. But again, it goes back to the point that I made, in that it still is going to essentially want to bring up the exposure of darker skin, and that's not what you want. So you have to understand that concept, okay? The meter is there to help you, but if you're relying solely on that, you're going to be overexposing dark skin most of the time. Now, the second thing that you have to keep in mind is that darker skin is technically less reflective because it is darker than white skin. So it technically is less reflective, but from an appearance perspective, it appears more reflective. And that really has to do with your highlights and your shadows. Now, if you take a white person, for example, especially a pale person, but they don't even have to be pale. If you take a white person, when you take into account the highlights on that white person versus their skin tone, there's not much contrast. There's not much of a difference in terms of the luminosity and the color. If you have a white-ish highlight against white-ish skin, it really is kind of flat in terms of, the dynamic range and what you're seeing. Whereas when you have a darker skin tone, you have your dark skin paired with a very light or bright highlight. Because that contrast is so stark, that highlight, that reflected light, is going to appear brighter. You literally can have two faces, white face, black face, side by side, expose them exactly the same, and the highlight is going to appear brighter on the darker skin than it does the whiter skin, even though more than likely the reflected light and the exposure of that highlight is exactly the same if you bring it into Lightroom. Of course, there's some things that could change that makeup. There's a lot of things that could affect the reflectivity of the light. But all things equal, it really would be the same, but it would look brighter on the darker skin just because of the contrast. And the way our eyes work, our eyes don't see light linearly. So our eyes do a lot of crazy things, and so things will appear a certain way to our eyes, even though that's not the case. And you see this all the time with optical illusions, okay? That's a clear example of things being something, but our eyes and our brain perceiving it differently. So you also have to take that into account. And when you have black skin, the bigger issue with the highlights is that in those highlights you lose a lot of the color. So where white skin is a lot more forgiving, and you can be off on your exposure a little bit, or you could have more specular highlights or brighter highlights and still get away with it, and the person still really looks like how they look in real life. Black skin isn't going to work that same way, and you do have to be a little bit more precise in your exposure, because the brighter that highlight, the whiter it's going to appear. And white is not brown, or white is not brown. White is not your darker skin tones. And so you really have to be more precise in that. Now, in that same world, black skin is going to handle specular light versus a softer light differently than white skin. Now, again, technically it isn't, okay? At the end of the day, all things considered, if you had two identical faces and one was one shade and one was the other, the light is hitting it the same. It's really going to do the same thing, but it's all perception and how we see it. And so specular light on darker skin is going to appear more bright, more harsh than it would on white skin. So in my opinion, I tend to use softer light when I'm photographing dark skin. Now, that doesn't mean you have to. I'm absolutely not saying you have to. And as a matter of fact, if you have dark skin, especially if you have like darker skin, like not like milk chocolate brown, but like dark chocolate, dark skin, that skin tone handles specular highlights really well, especially if they have good skin, and you really can produce some amazing results with it. So I'm definitely not saying, don't use harsh light. I never use a hard light source. I don't do specular on dark skin. I'm not saying that at all. Definitely not the case. But in general, when I am photographing darker skin, I'm going to want to use a softer light, mainly because I want the transition from shadow to highlight to be softer. So that way I'm not losing too much of that color in the highlight, but also I don't see the stark drastic difference between the shadow and the highlight, which is going to appear more prominent on your darker skin than your whiter skin. So my recommendations for photographing darker skin tones. Number one, you got to understand that your camera meter is going to be off, and on average, I'm going to be anywhere from a half a stop to up to 2 stops underexposed based off of that meter. It just is what it is. In most cases, if that meter is at 0, you're going to be overexposing that darker skin tone, and that's not what you want. So know that, play around with that. It obviously is going to make a difference depending upon whether you're photographing, more of like an olive skin tone or a milk chocolate, or if you're going down the lines of like a dark chocolate skin tone. You're going to fall somewhere on that range. Of course, you can kind of play with it to taste, but just know that that meter is just not going to work for you in that realm. It is what it is. You also have to take into account your background. So if you're photographing a dark individual on a light background, if you're using something like evaluative metering, you can run into the issue where you actually can potentially underexpose, because of course it's trying to meter for, the white background. So you just have to understand that the meter is honestly just kind of a starting point, and it's not really going to get you where you need to be. You just have to look at what you have, and it can be difficult to try to look at your screen and get that to match what's in front of you, because screens are, for the most part, they're backlit. So things always appear more bright on screen. Think of it like when you see something on a screen versus seeing something printed. Things are different on screens versus in real life. So it can be a bit tricky, and depending upon your brightness setting as well, it can be very tricky to look at your screen and be able to say, okay, this looks about right. You really have to do a lot of playing around and testing and saying, okay, when I take this picture and I'm at, this is where my meter falls, or this is where it looks on my screen. This is how I know it looks in real life. And, I did a lot of testing when I bought my mannequin years and years and years ago, because I really wanted to get to a point where I can look at what I'm seeing on my screen using the meter, using the histogram, using the tools that I have, and being able to say, I feel confident that the image that I'm producing in terms of luminosity, in terms of color, in terms of hue, all of those things, it is very close to what I'm seeing in real life. So a lot of this just comes from experience and practice. But what I would say is a good starting point is when you are photographing darker skin, meter a stop under. Now that might be a little bit too much depending on the skin tone, but it at least is going to get you in the frame of mind to essentially underexposed based off of what the camera thinks, and that's going to give you a pretty solid base to where even if it was slightly off, a third of a stop, something like that, even a half a stop, it's still going to be better than overexposing your subject and washing out that skin or having that black skin look ashy. You would really want to err more on the side of slightly darker than overexposing that skin tone. So understand that about the meter, and then also just be very careful of the exposure of your highlights. You're just not going to have the latitude with darker skin as you do with whiter skin. You really want those highlights to be properly exposed. You don't want to lose too much color. You don't want to lose the texture, because these are things that culturally are very important to people with darker skin tones. And so you have to respect that. So your exposure is going to have to be a little bit more spot on. And it's going to be easier to do that with a softer light source. If you are not very familiar or experienced with light, you are going to want to use a soft, very soft light source, because that's going to be a lot more forgiving for you. If you're going to use a hard light, you really have to pick your modifier correctly. Your light placement needs to be correct. Your power setting on your flash or your light source really needs to be accurate. So using that hard light requires a lot more experience and expertise. So if you don't have that, that's okay. Go with a big soft light that's going to be a lot more forgiving. It's really going to have nice smooth transitions between your shadows and highlights, and that's going to help retain a lot of that color in that highlight. You're not going to blow it out, and you won't have this stark contrast between the two. Now, in that vein, something that can help you is utilizing a CPL filter. Now, a CPL filter just helps to reduce reflectivity and light. Now, there are some technical things with CPL filters for them to work, and light placement and all of that sort of thing. But CPL filters can be helpful because they can help reduce the glare or the reflection in those highlights, which will help you retain the color. If you've ever seen someone use a CPL filter when they're photographing cars, you can definitely see the impact that that filter can have, and it can have the same impact on darker skin tones, not necessarily to the same degree, but it definitely can have that same impact and help reduce that brightness in that highlight, which helps retain that color, which helps the overall look of the skin tone on that particular individual. Now keep in mind that skin tones for the most part are really a shade of dark orange. There is a little bit of red in there, but for the most part it's a shade of dark orange. In darker skin you're going to have more saturated orange, so you really have to be careful with your white balance setting, and you don't want the skin to appear too warm. Now again, lighter skin, white skin, can handle having that temperature be a lot warmer than darker skin. With the darker skin you're going to get more into that orange versus that brown, and it just doesn't look good. Okay, no one wants to is it a Oompa Loompa? Is the Oompa Loompa was red, or is that when people are really short? Or orange, or is that when people are really short? It's probably when people are really short. I don't know. I don't watch that stuff. But you really want to be careful of that. So you got to be careful with your white balance, especially when you're doing like golden hour. When you shoot golden hour, because darker skin tones are already saturated with, you know, a deep orange anyway, when you have a orange light source, so, you know, sunrise, sunset, or if you're using a continuous light, tungsten, whatever the case may be, you really want to be careful with your white balance, because when you have a skin tone that has a dark orange base and then you're adding orange light to it, and then if your white balance is, you know, making everything appear even more warm, you really can run into, you're moving away from those shades of brown that your subject likes and adores and moving more towards orange, and that's just not going to look good. So you do have to be careful with your white balance. You really have to perfect that. And I think the gist of really what you can get if you've listened to all of this is that with darker skin tones, it requires intentionality, which I preach all the time, but also I think what you could take from this is that you really have to be more precise when you are photographing darker skin tones. That's ultimately what it comes down to. At the end of the day, there really isn't anything different with photographing darker people than white people. The difference is that you just don't have as much latitude to be incorrect in what you're doing. So white skin, you can be a little overexposed and it still looks okay. White skin, you can be a little bit warmer on your white balance and it can still look okay. White people, you can have the specular highlights a little bit more because it'll be okay, because you can't see them. They're not perceived as much. Whereas on your darker skin tones, you simply don't have that latitude to be able to be off as much. So you really have to fine tune what you're doing and finesse it in a way to where you're achieving the results that you need to achieve. At the end of the day, that's really what it boils down to.